Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I'm just here to talk about my week of reading and maybe talk about what I plan to read in the coming week. So, like, subscribe, grab a cup of tea, run away with your next door neighbour and open a B&B in Milton Keynes, because I've got a few things to talk about today. Surprisingly, I actually read this week, which means that I did not write it all, but I did take a few hours here and there to sit down in my corner and finish reading The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. Earlier this year, I read The Secret History, and I liked it more than I thought I would, but I did think that it went on a bit longer than it needed to. So, for my birthday, I asked for this book. Because I was hankering after the previous title, I thought, no, let's knuckle down and finally read what my friend Joy says is her favourite Donna Tartt novel. And weirdly, perhaps not weirdly, out of the blue, unexpectedly, I ended up concurring with that. I thought that this was Donna Tartt's best work. I have read all three now. I read The Goldfinch twice, and my opinion changed of that upon the second read and hearing other people's opinions. I actually intend to go back and reread it a third time. The Little Friend follows the character of Harriet. 12 years earlier, her older brother was murdered and found in the backyard, and this tore her family apart. What she decides she's going to do is find her brother's killer, because they were never caught, and kill them. She is only a child throughout this book, and because of that there is an innocence to the tale where the reader is able to understand things and read between the lines of stuff that is happening that perhaps Harriet doesn't, and it's because of her impetuous nature and the way that she does things without worrying about the consequences that adds a believability to this book. There is a very dark undertone. At the back of this book it calls it a Southern Gothic, and there is racism in here, there's racist language in here, there is horrible things happening to animals throughout. There are quite a few mentions of traumatic things. There is child death. It deals with incredibly hefty topics and the way that grief can fracture a family and the long-standing effects of it. It reminded me almost of Dickens in its grotesque characters, in its side plots that you don't think are going to mean anything and then all seem to come together in the end. There is an awful lot of foreshadowing in this book. There is that quote by some author about if you introduce a gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1, it best go off by Act 3. So as soon as I saw a gun in here, I knew what was going to happen with that. It was a book where I felt like I was in the hand of an assured writer who knew what they were doing, who had really worked on their craft and understood everything they wanted to do in order to tell this story. I honestly found it quite stupendous. When I wasn't reading it, I wanted to be reading it. I was wondering what was going on with the characters. When I had to go to work, I was getting frustrated because I didn't want to be at work. I wanted to be at home finding out what was happening with these characters and learning about their exploits. I found a character here who I long to return to see how they're getting on, despite the fact that there is this only one title. It's always going to end the same way. I think it's a book that, despite its length, demands rereading. While Donna Tartt might have crafted almost caricatures of characters in that same way that Dickens does, she crafts really memorable characters because of their grotesque qualities. There is language in here that is tough to read, and I'm not sure within today's publishing standards, the way that things are, the way that people are and readers are, whether that would disincline people to read it. But unfortunately, it did add an honesty and a truth to the era in which this book was set. You have Harriet not really recognising the racism going on around her, because to her that's the way that the world is. And although people behave in certain ways and have behaviours that they don't deem racist, a modern reader, and probably even the reader who was reading this 20 years ago when this book came out, can recognise those problems. But it's a difficult one to navigate when your, not narrator, but your protagonist is not recognising these things. It leaves it with the reader to sit in being uncomfortable then, and that's one of the things I think that is also done well. This book is incredibly uncomfortable and tense, but also manages to convey a very vivid picture of a town, and I think that that's something that this book does more than the other two titles that I've read by Donna Tartt. Is it crafts an entire picture of the town and the inhabitants of it and the way that it operates, and because of that it almost felt like this very dark vacation. You want to be out of it, you want to get away from these characters, but you also want to see how this tale turns out, and you're scared for all of the characters and stuff that's going on, and even the antagonists within the tale, you feel sorry for them, and you feel sympathy for them when you discover certain things about their lives. And I think that it was nice to have a tale from Donna Tartt in the third person, exploring the lives of other people, and it gave it a sense of being a character piece. It felt very whole as a narrative, and at one point I did think that the book was going on too long after a certain event had happened, and I realised it hadn't. It ended just where it needed to, and although in this book not all of the loose ends were tied up, I appreciate that, because I think upon a reread those unanswered questions might actually develop answers. And yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to returning to this book one day, because I thoroughly enjoyed it, and quite honestly it could be my favourite of the year. Having had such a great reading experience with that book and having all these questions asked of me as a reader, I wanted something of a palate cleanser, and so I went to Johnny and the Dead by Terry Pratchett. A very short book, a book that I wanted to read as a teenager, but I kept putting off because I thought I needed to read the first book first, and this and its sequel were the only ones my school library had. This is part of the Johnny Maxwell series, and in this one, Johnny develops the ability to speak to the dead. And he develops this one day when he knocks on a graveyard, when he's walking through a graveyard and he knocks on a grave, and this alderman steps out of it. And then they discover that there are plans to remove all of the graves, remove all of the bodies, and develop on the graveyard plot. So then we follow Johnny for about 150 pages as he decides to try and put a stop to them developing on this land and respecting the dead that are there. It is a bit of a comic novel, naturally, given Terry Pratchett. I found myself laughing a fair bit with the jokes that were being made. It's one where if I'd read it as a child, I might not have got the jokes, but as an adult, I got them, and I appreciated that. And again, we have another book that begs a reread when I'm just looking for something light and humorous and nostalgic. There is an incredibly nostalgic quality to this book, given the fact that it came out in the early 90s. And not least because I was reading these shorter books for younger readers by Pratchett when I was a teenager. So it was just nice to return to this style from this author. I don't regret leaving it 20 years from when I first discovered this book existed to now. Enjoyed this one. It was the palate cleanser I needed so that I could move on to a book that also ended up becoming a favourite of the year. And that book is the Whisperwicks, The Impossible Trials by Jordan Lees. I exalted the first book last year. I was working on my own middle grade book and decided to read some fiction, and I picked the first book up at the library last year, read the prologue whilst I was waiting to go to the writers group, and put it back on the shelf and thought, well, we'll see. However, the entire 2 hours that I was sat in that writers group, I was just there hoping that the book didn't go. I needed to see how it turned out, and I ended up enthralled by the Whisperwicks. The Labyrinth of the Lost and Found is an incredibly creepy novel for middle grade readers. It had a darkness to it that reminded me of Return to Oz, as did this second volume. Here we have Benjamin returning to the Reading world, he has this witch stone around his eye, which means that he's going to have to fulfill the impossible trials of Agatha Drake, a witch from thousands of years ago. He meets up with his friends again, Isabelle, Silas the Mapmaker, Ariadne the Thread, and Nuisance his puppet. And they head off to complete these trials, but now they are being chased by scratchlings who have these witchstone masks attached to their faces that mean they've forgotten who they are. And there is a plot of children going missing, which might be related to our villains from the first book. Here we have an incredibly tense but brilliant tale in which we see the power of friendship and tale of learning to belong and feeling torn between two worlds and two places. There are some great metaphors and allegory in here for the things going on in Benjamin's life in the real world and his life in the Reading world. We have the sense of danger, and yeah, I can't say anything other than I started it on, was it Tuesday night, worked Wednesday and finished it Thursday. It is an incredible sequel that had me wanting to go back and write my own children's books again. Indeed, there were things in here that I had planned in my children's book, and I was like, darn it, somebody else got there first. And I was like, do you know what? I'm thrilled. I am thrilled that this book exists. I look forward to the third book coming out next spring. They have been brilliant ways to spend days in the autumn, and I think that if you have a middle grade reader in your life, you really should set them onto this series, especially at this time of year. They are fantastic to read in the autumn. This book might be set at midsummer, but there is almost a sense of festivity and Christmas given midsummer proceedings. Yeah, I wholeheartedly recommend this series. I recommend this author. There is a magic and a wonder in the prose that I am enthralled by, and I think that this writer is just doing an incredible job, and I can't sing its praises highly enough. Which meant I then needed another palate cleanser, so I went to How to Fly in 10,000 Easy Lessons, which is Barbara Kingsolver's poetry collection. When I first started reading this a couple of years ago or earlier this year, I don't know, I couldn't really get into the poems. I didn't know what Kingsolver was doing, so I put it aside and I started it again after finishing the Whisperwicks. And there are poems in here that I don't understand. Maybe they require a reread. And then there are poems in here that are doing things that I love, which are poems that rely on sound. You've got some great assonance, alliteration, consonants, all of that stuff. The stuff that I really like to read in poetry in those poems. And then you have almost biographical poems. I like the way that the poet uses the form to get across what they want to get across, the emotion and the feeling. And there are tales of grief, tales of love, tales of not loyalty, but being a parent and how that changes you. And there are recurrent themes, which is great. And you get some of the poetic prose that you see in Kingsolver's novels, which I appreciated. However, again, there are poems in here that I simply did not understand, and maybe they bear a reread again. While I think it's a strong poetry collection from this author, there is an issue where I felt sometimes like, because it was told in parts, it felt a lot like disparate pieces at times, but maybe it was just a way for this poet to explore all the themes that they wanted to explore. However, saying that, there was part of me that did think that maybe Kingsolver just had all these poems and wanted them to see the light of day, so bundled them all together. I don't know. I was glad to read Kingsolver's poetry. It did do what I needed it to, which was to be a palate cleanser so that I can go on and hopefully find something more fantastic to read after reading two great books this week. But this just, it wasn't my favourite poetry collection, but there were poems in here that stuck with me, and there were certain lines, especially one about a sycamore tree, that I just thought captured a feeling incredibly well. But for as many great poems, there were mediocre ones, which I think you get in any collection. Now, to talk about some of the books that I have picked up in the last week. My friend Joy read this book because it was written by her friend's grandson. I believe that her friend has now passed and that the author has dedicated this book to his grandmother, but that book is Spiralling by Cal Speet. Joy read this book and thought, although it was modern, it was fantastic, and I thought, well, I'll borrow it. The blurb reads, Gabriel is at rock bottom. A scandalous breakup with his wannabe poet ex-boyfriend, followed by a sudden sacking, and he's spiralling. Thank God for his best friends who are committed to pulling him out of his depression hole. But suddenly there are new problems. How can he convince discreet hung from Grindr to go on a real-life date? Could the gorgeous man in the post office be the one? Funny, outrageous, and scarily relatable, Spiralling is a love letter to beautiful friendship, groups, and community. And I do hope to be able to read this one over the next week, but I'm going to talk about my pile of possibilities momentarily because I'm aware that I have Victober coming up, so I might have to do some rearranging and prioritising certain books over others. Then a book I picked up from the charity shop is Marble Hall Murders by Anthony Horowitz, which is the third in the Susan Ryland series following Magpie Murders and Moonflower Murders. Now you might have been following this channel for a while and know that I did not like those previous two titles. However, I do like the TV show with Leslie Manville. Therefore, I want to read Marble Hall Murders to prepare myself whilst I wait for that series to come out. And a volunteer of mine has read this and thoroughly enjoyed it, so I'm hopeful. I generally like the Atticus Pund parts of these books more than I like the Susan Ryland parts. I guess we'll just see. We'll see how things go. I might hate it as much as I dislike the first two, but you never know. Then Fly on the Wall Press sent me two books. I have The Subtle Art of Short Fiction, which is edited by Isabelle Kenyon and is all about learning to master short stories. And then I also have The Water That May Come by Amy Lilwall. Let me just read the blurb. As rising seas threaten to engulf Britain, 4 lives are on the brink. Pinko, a privileged heir clinging to decadence. Jane, a working-class veterinary nurse racing to reunite her family. Jane's pregnant teenage daughter Ashley grappling with impending motherhood. And humble young artist Gavin. With sanctuary beckoning across the channel, each faces impossible choices. Who will they save? What will they sacrifice? A lyrical, thought-provoking novel which blurs borders and challenges notions of identity and belonging. In a future where we all may become refugees, how far would you go to stay afloat? So this one I have to get read and reviewed before the end of November, and similarly the same with this. So you can expect reviews of these books on the channel. Also, Fly on the Wall Press have been incredibly kind to me. Because I've worked with them a few times in the past, they have given me a discount code for you lovely lot. So you, if you want to acquire anything from their website, during checkout, use the discount code Charles10 and that will give you 10% off your order. You never know. You might want The Subtle Art of Short Fiction. You might want The Water That May Come, or another book I could recommend is The Process of Poetry by a writing acquaintance of mine, Rosanna McGlone, and that has a load of poets who are discussing their approach to poetry. So, you know, have at it. Finally, just a few titles that I've also got on a pile of possibilities, despite having those books as well, are The Carpet People by Terry Pratchett. This one I'm considering listening to because I found out there's an audiobook narrated by David Tennant. I had a friend back at high school who recommended this book to me, and then I could just never find it. My library didn't have it, the school library didn't have it. But this one is apparently co-written between Terry Pratchett, aged 17, and him aged 43. So it was published when he was 17, and then when he reached 43, he looked back and he rewrote it heavily. And apparently there are quite a lot of major differences, but I'm reading the one that came out in the 90s. I've also been wondering about rereading Truckers, because this is one that I did read as a teenager, and I've been wanting to actually find out how this series finishes, because I read the first 2 books when I was younger and my school library didn't have the 3rd book, and nor did my other library. We were very woefully short on Terry Pratchett, which is often the way with big series and authors who write a lot of books. You know, I just wasn't the type of person who had money that I could reserve books willy-nilly. So my plan is to find Diggers and to read Truckers, Diggers and Wings. I thought I had one of the sequels in my room, but it turns out I just have 2 copies of Truckers, so you never know. And then finally, I really need to read The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. Charlie and I are no longer doing a buddy read vlog of this because Charlie started it and is looking to find new favourites and just isn't ready for this. So I was going to read this month and then accidentally ticked off that I'd read it, so completely forgot I got it on my TBR. Maybe I could read it before the end of the month. We will see. But yeah, that was just shortlisted for the Booker. I was actually really lucky with the Booker Prize this year because I was just reading the books that I already had or had access to from the long list. And when they've announced a shortlist, I either already have them as NetGalley editions or I got them from the charity shop. So if I want to read the entirety of the shortlist, I can. Anyway, that's me. If you would like to talk about any of the books that I have discussed in this video, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video because until next time, that is all.